Hi, class. Welcome to the beginning of Unit 4. This unit is going to talk about the nationalism that took place after the War of 1812. It's going to talk about the economic developments that took place that were actually already in place before the War of 1812, but the War of 1812 is really going to facilitate some of these economic trends. Uh, Eventually, we'll get to, in this unit, the resurgence of sectionalism and the rise of Andrew Jackson. That'll be at the end of this unit. However, we will begin pretty much where we left off at the end of Unit 3 with the end of the War of 1812 and the era of good feelings that began pretty much right after the war ended. So, after the War of 1812, there will be a lot of nationalism within the United States, a surge in patriotism, and usually what nationalism does is it unifies the country. And so you will see patriotism represented and nationalism represented in our culture. Our culture will become distinct from Europe in a lot of ways. You will see more unity when it comes to politics. Basically, the Federalist Party dies away or dies off, and you have the Democratic Republicans left, basically just one political party, which creates some unity, some measure of unity. The Supreme Court is going to make some rulings, and the Supreme Court's rulings are going to increase the power of the federal government over the states. However, during this time of national unity, it kind of makes sense that sectionalism will be kind of swept under the rug, and the states will kind of, if you will, put up with an expansion of the federal government's power or the national government's power during this time of nationalism and national unity. We'll also talk about how we start to expand our country in terms of territory. And, uh, and finally, I will talk about how we will create plans, or at least discuss plans to grow our national economy. And a lot of this economic growth will be seen in westward expansion and not as much in terms of being tied to Europe, to the old world. So, all in all, nationalism is going to take hold during the era of good feelings after the War of 1812, and it'll be manifested, this nationalism, in many different aspects of society, in culture, in politics, in Supreme Court rulings, in land expansion, and in the economy. And I will pretty much go through American nationalism in the order that those categories are listed. So soon after the War of 1812 ends, James Monroe will be elected President of the United States. There you see him on the left. And he is one of these presidents that's lucky enough to be elected basically during a time when things are going well. Now, when things are going well, people blame the president. So that's good for Monroe. When things are going not so well, people blame the president. And you'll see later on in history when things don't go well, oftentimes the president gets blamed. Monroe will be one of those lucky politicians that gets to oversee the era of good feelings. Now, he does do his part in some places to contribute to this, but it also kind of falls in his lap that he becomes president during a very positive time in American history, right after the conclusion of the War of 1812. And just to remind you, class, remember that nationalism is basically a super form of patriotism, an extra strong feeling, if you will, of patriotism. And if you look at the notes here, you can see that I'm going to go from this concept of nationalism. There's an arrow that points to the next box, and it'll talk more specifically about nationalism after the War of 1812. But keep in mind that we're in this time period known as the era of good feelings, which pretty much last for the duration of Monroe's presidency. So he'll be president from 1816 to about 18, well, till 1825. So he'll be elected president in 1816, and he'll serve until the beginning of 1825, and that's roughly the time period of the era of good feelings. When Andrew Jackson comes along, sectionalism will return. There will be other cracks in this nationalism that will cause sectionalism to return, especially over the issue of slavery. Right now, though, the northern states and the southern states, their differences are being overshadowed by this happy feeling of nationalism. And again, you see that painting that I pointed at in the last lesson. And again, it really does represent the nationalism of the time period where we say we owe allegiance to no crown. We are turning our backs on the old world. We have broken, if you look again at the painting, we have broken chains with the old world. So Again, nationalism will overshadow sectionalism largely during this time period. The country will be more unified. Yes, the northern states and the southern states are going to have their differences. The emerging western states are going to have differences as well. But in the end, again, the sectionalism is going to be largely overshadowed by nationalism. So again, the mood of the era of good feelings is nationalism, national unity, feeling good about the country as a whole. The differences will show back up by the end of this lecture. So the country, for example, is going to start developing its own culture. I will get more into that in a moment. And remember that we are going to develop a culture that is much less European and much more unique to the United States. It's almost as if you could say that if you're graduating high school, a lot of your identity is wrapped up in your family and it's wrapped up in your parents. And then once you graduate high school, you might move out of the house, you might go off and live somewhere else, and you start to form an identity that, even if it has its roots in your past, it's going to start to develop uniquely. You're going to develop your own unique identity, and that's what really happens after the War of 1812. During this time, the power of the national government, aka the federal government, is going to grow. And this is not something that a lot of Southerners liked very much, and some Westerners didn't like this very much because they believed in stronger state governments. But again, during this time of nationalism, the states' rights feelings are again going to be overshadowed by the patriotism, the pride that the country shared. And remember, all regions of the country had shared in this war, in fighting this war. The North had fought along the Canadian border. The South had fought in the Washington, D.C., Chesapeake area, and the Battle of New Orleans took place in the southwestern part of the nation. So again, all parts of the country kind of came out of this war feeling pride. Now, typically, what happens when a country is filled with nationalism and filled with patriotism, there's usually also a desire to expand, both in terms of territory and you usually see economic growth. When people are feeling good, they like to buy things. When people are feeling good, the economy usually picks up. People in good moods buy more products, and that creates more businesses, that creates more jobs. And so, what the country's government, the states, and the federal government are going to have to do is find ways to help the economy expand. So, our country's physical size is going to expand during this time. We are going to settle more states. We are going to end up taking Florida from Spain. I'll get to that later. And our economy will also expand. So, that last bullet there, this will be the subject pretty much of the backside of this lecture. These bullets above it will be talked about on the front side of the lecture. So there's your preview. Pretty much this slide previews the whole rest of the lecture. So let's talk about the cultural aspects of nationalism first. When it comes to literature, our stories are going to start having American settings. For example, you'll have the story of The Last of the Mohicans, which deals with Native Americans. You will see other stories like that taking place. So basically, instead of stories having European settings taking place, say, in England or in France, they will take place in the United States. Legend of Sleepy Hollow, I believe, is another story that comes along around this time, maybe a little bit later on, but it still makes this point that we're turning to American settings. You will have American themes in our stories. You will see American stories that are more about individuality and about American ideals of freedom of expression and things like that. Overall, our literature will become more American in its style and in its subject matter. Noah Webster, not to be confused with Daniel Webster, a different Webster that I'll talk about later on in this course, but Noah Webster is the Webster that you associate with the dictionary. So during the era of good feelings, and around this time period, Noah Webster will write what's known as the blue-backed speller, which is going to formally create American English. Now, what's interesting is that before this time period, people would either write in a more British style or they would just kind of spell words the way they felt like they should be spelled. What the blueback speller is going to do is it's going to standardize the way our English spelling is done, and it is going to be done in a way that is distinct from Britain. And if you look in some books, if you've seen this, you may have seen this before, where American authors, the way they spell some words are different from British authors. So again, American English will become distinct from British English. Some of these spellings are pretty subtle, but they are different. Noah Webster will also start to develop lessons for some schools in the United States, and these lessons are going to very much emphasize patriotism, nationalism. They'll have American settings and American themes in the lessons, and he earns the nickname, like you see here in the picture, as the schoolmaster of the Republic. So Noah Webster, again, is going to develop a very American version of English and also American version of school curriculum. Finally, in art, you will have a group of landscape painters known collectively as the Hudson River School. And the Hudson River School, what they will do is they will paint landscapes. So they're kind of, if you've heard of Bob Ross, they're kind of like the Bob Ross of the era of good feelings. And their paintings are not going to be of European landscapes, not European mountains, not European rivers. They're going to be celebrating American landscapes. And I'll give you a couple of examples of their paintings in a moment here. But again, remember that the Hudson River School, when they painted landscapes, they weren't painting the Swiss Alps, they weren't painting the English countryside, they were painting American scenes. For example, if you look at this painting here, you can see that they have painted Niagara Falls. If you've ever visited Niagara Falls, you know it's a lot more crowded these days. Buffalo's on one side, Buffalo, New York, Toronto, Canada is on the other side. But this is before all the buildup. The pristine beauty of the waterfalls are seen here. And I do advise anyone that ever gets the chance, go visit Niagara Falls. They are quite amazing. So that would be an example of something that the Hudson River School would paint. They would paint American scenes, and this is probably the most majestic set of waterfalls in the United States. This picture here again shows an American landscape, and this is a river. This is the Connecticut River, and this is a famous bend in the river known as the Oxbow. So again, you see the celebration of American landscapes. Now, there is some extra meaning to this painting, this being the shadow here. Some people would say that what the shadow is the effect of American factories and American industries and how that might impact the environment. And we will talk about industrialization a little bit later on in this unit. Again, then factories pop up, especially in the New England area, which is where this scene is painted. These factories do put out a lot of pollution, so there is this kind of impending crisis, if you will, of the negative relationship between American manufacturing and the factories and the pollution they put out, and the pristine nature of the Americas. Okay, and I will skip this one pretty much, but that would be a scene from the Appalachian Mountains, again showing the beauty, American natural beauty, not European. On to politics. And I went through this chart in the previous lecture, so I won't go through this one again. But remember that during the War of 1812, the Federalist Party had basically criticized the war, and after the war, the American people felt pretty good about things, and so it made the Federalist Party look unpatriotic. And remember that the Federalist Party had already done some other negative things. They had done power grabs with the Alien and Sedition Acts. They had done power grabs with the Midnight Judges, and then they came out of the War of 1812 looking like they favored Britain instead of the United States. And so the Federalist Party is going to lose its popularity during the era of good feelings. It will die out, and you only have one political party left. And this is the only time in American history where there has been one and only one major party, this time the Democratic Republican Party. So for the next couple of presidential terms during Monroe's presidency, and he was a Democratic Republican, there will be only one party. And when there's only one party, there's a whole lot more political unity. You don't have people that are members of one party fighting against members of another party because everyone's in the same party. And therefore also there will be more willingness to compromise on political issues. That being said, not everyone within the Democratic Republican Party agreed with everything everyone else was saying, so you will see some cracks in the party, and eventually the political parties will split in 1824 and in the years right after 1824, and you will see the return of a two political party system. And Andrew Jackson is a big part of that. Basically, you either loved Andrew Jackson or you hated Andrew Jackson. There wasn't much room in between, and whenever he rises to prominence and runs for president in 1824, you'll see the beginning of the split of the Democratic Republican Party into two new parties. And those parties will be the Democrats, like modern day Democrats, and another party that no longer exists, known as the Whigs. More on that later on. Okay, now let's talk about the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court at this point is going to make many rulings that are going to increase the power of the federal government over the states. But again, during this time, the mood of the country was more in favor of national unity instead of what individual states were wanting. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of the only Chief Justices that you'll need to know for this class, will be John Marshall. And overall, his rulings will reflect nationalism and they will strengthen the power of the federal government over the states. Now, remember at this point that the states might not always like the rulings, but because of the mood of the country, it's almost like they put up with some of these rulings. And I could tell you about probably a dozen Supreme Court cases that relate to this idea of strengthening the power of the federal government over the states, or strengthening the power of the federal government in general. Strengthening the power of the Supreme Court as well. But I will give you the major two examples. And so go down to case number 1, and then we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about case number 2. And if you'll notice the arrows that are coming off the box you've just filled in, we will come back to that idea once we've gone through the two main cases. If you've taken a civics class, you've probably heard of these cases. Now I'm going to give you their historical context. So case number 1. And that will be McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, the issue in this case was the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States, again, had not been popular with some southern states, had not been popular with some western states, but especially some southern states. And they didn't think it was constitutional. They thought it was giving too much power to the federal government. So the Supreme Court is going to address this. So what ends up happening is that the branches of the Bank of the United States that were in the southern state of Maryland are going to be attacked by Maryland. Maryland is going to try to tax the Bank of the United States, at least the branches of the bank in Maryland. And the idea was that if they taxed the Bank of the United States in Maryland, they would tax it to death. They would tax it so much that the bank would fall apart there. And under John Marshall, the Supreme Court ruling will be that if there is an agency or an institution of the federal government, that states are not allowed to interfere with those federal agencies. And in fact, John Marshall is quoted as saying that the power to tax is the power to destroy. So basically, if the federal government creates a program, say later on the federal government created Social Security, that happened happens in American history too, happens in the 1930s. Some states were critical of the creation of Social Security, and they may not have liked it, but this ruling says basically that states, whether or not they like a federal institution, they're not allowed to interfere. So this does give the federal government over the states. But before I go to that point, let's think about this other point. This was the ripe opportunity to decide at the Supreme Court level whether or not the Bank of the United States was constitutional. Remember that states had disagreed over whether or not the Bank of the United States was constitutional. Well, in this case, the Supreme Court is going to basically be saying that the BUS, or the Bank of the United States, or the National Bank, all the same thing, it's going to be basically saying that the Bank of the United States is constitutional. If the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional, then the Supreme Court probably would have ruled in favor of Maryland and would have allowed for Maryland to destroy the Bank of the United States there. But they didn't. So kind of indirectly at this point, the Supreme Court has said that the Bank of the United States is constitutional. Also significantly, like I was mentioning a moment before, this does establish the federal government as supreme over the states, at least when it comes to federal agencies or federal institutions, like the Bank of the United States. So whether or not the states like a federal institution, if the government creates a federal institution, then that means that the states basically have to go along with this. It establishes the federal government's power over the states in terms of institutions. On to case number 2. Case number 2 has to do with what I'll call interstate commerce or trade between the states. So there will be a Supreme Court case called Gibbons versus Ogden, and what happens is that there's going to be a state that's going, this time New York, that's going to allow a steamboat company, and I'll talk more about steamboats later on in this unit and the inventor of the steamboat and its effects. More on that later. But at this point, there's going to be a river, the Hudson River, and New York is going to give a specific steamboat company a license to operate on the waters of the Hudson River. The problem with the Hudson River is that it doesn't stay in New York. The Hudson River eventually goes to other states. It goes to New Jersey. It borders New Jersey. And so the question is, what happens if a river goes through more than one state? Does one state have authority over that river but not another state? Or do the states have to somehow share authority over the river? And what the federal government is going to rule is that anything that involves trade, whether it be on a river or later on through roads or railroads, anything that involves trade between states, anything that involves trade that crosses state lines, the authority automatically goes to the federal government. No state can control trade that goes beyond that state's borders. If any trade goes beyond that state's borders, like steamboats on the Hudson River, then it's up to the federal government to decide who has authority over that trade. So what this does, and you need to star this one, this will be a much bigger deal in American history too. But what this does is it establishes the federal government's authority over interstate commerce, and commerce is another word for trade. A great modern example of this would be the interstate highway system. The federal government has authority over the interstate highway system because the interstates, like Interstate 77 or Interstate 40, it crosses over state lines. And since it crosses over state lines, final authority over the interstate highway system goes to the federal government. And in fact, if the federal government wanted to change the speed limit to a speed limit that states did not like, the states would just have to deal with it because the federal government has authority over the interstates. So again, this ruling gives the federal government power to regulate any kind of trade that happens between states. And of course, lots of trade happens on the interstate highway system. Just look at how many tractor trailers there are on the interstate highways. The power to regulate interstate commerce has been exercised multiple times by the federal government in history, especially in American history too. But long story short, again, this does expand the power of the federal government, in this case, over the national economy. Now, let me rewind and tell you real quickly that there was no interstate highway system yet at this point, and there will be fights over who has the right to build roads, whether the federal government should build highways or whether states should build highways. But regardless, at this point, if any trade happens between states, no state has single authority over trade that happens over state lines. That power goes to the federal government. So this does set the precedent for the federal government having more control and more say in the national economy. And by the end of this unit, we will talk about the development of a new national economy. That'll be known as the market revolution. We'll get to that later. Overall, both case number 1 and case number 2 is going to increase the supremacy of the federal government over the states. Now, eventually the states are going to think that the federal government has gone too far. Eventually the states are going to feel like the federal government has gotten so much power that it may even be a threat to institutions that some states like, that other states don't, like slavery. So eventually, this increased supremacy of the federal government is going to face resistance from states, especially southern states, especially over the issue of slavery. So again, I'm foreshadowing the coming of the Civil War. More on that later on in this course. Again, remember that in the long run, this course is kind of aiming towards the coming of the Civil War and its impact on the United States. Now on to the backside. So now we're going to talk about expanding our territory. So if you look at the middle box of this chart here, write in nationalism and expansion. Again, in the middle box, put nationalism and expansion. When countries are full of nationalism, they typically want to expand. And we will go to the upper left section of the chart first. But remember, the common theme is nationalism and expansion. So remember again that now we're up in the upper left box. Remember that whenever nationalism is strong in countries, typically these countries want to expand. A more modern example would be when Hitler took over in Germany. Hitler very much inspired nationalism in his country through some pretty sinister means, but it does inspire nationalism in Germany. And what does Germany do? They start taking over almost all of Europe. So when the United States is filled with nationalism after the War of 1812, one of the things they want to do is expand their territory. And if you look at the map here, you can see all the different territorial acquisitions that take place over time. And I will, by the end of this course, talk about how we get every single bit of this land. Again, whenever the country is filled with nationalism and we feel very good about our country and our government ways and our culture and our religion and again our politics, we want to take over other pieces of land and turn these pieces of land into parts of our country that reflect our values and what we find important. And we're going to want to expand, if you will, our democratic values to these other areas, although we don't always do so in reality, even though we claim to. I'll get more into that notion whenever I talk about the treatment of the Native Americans. Most of our expansion is going to end up being westward. We're going to start settling in the Louisiana territory. Eventually, we'll go and we'll take Texas. Eventually, we'll go and take land from Mexico, if you look at where I'm pointing. Eventually, we'll take this area of land. We'll stop sharing it with Britain. More on that later on. But the first piece of land that we'll set our sights on will be to the south. Spain still owns Florida, and we are going to decide that Florida should go to us. And who are we going to use to help get Florida? None other than War of 1812 hero Andrew Jackson. So Florida, again, was still owned by Spain right after the War of 1812, but it won't be owned by Spain for very long because basically we're going to force Florida to sell it to the United States. So how are we going to justify going into Florida? How are we going to justify basically invading Spanish-owned land? Well, one problem that we had as a nation was that the southern states were unhappy that southern slaves were running away to Florida. Now, obviously, today, slavery is seen as a bad thing, but at the time, the southern states looked at slaves as property. So basically, in a sense, Florida, Spanish-owned Florida, was allowing for the stealing of southern property, southern slaves. Also, along the border between Georgia, one of the United States, and Florida, along the border between Georgia and Florida, Seminole Native Americans were launching attacks into Georgia. There was border tension with Spanish-owned Florida. So what ends up happening is that the government is going to authorize the still popular General Andrew Jackson to go into Florida to stop Seminole attacks. That's his order. His order is not to take over Florida. His order is not to attack any Spaniards. His order is to attack the Seminoles and make them stop causing border disputes. And a lot of the times when slaves ran away, they would run away and then find refuge with the Seminoles, and the Seminoles would give slaves a new place to live. So keep in mind what Andrew Jackson's assignment is. He's ordered into Florida to stop the Seminoles from committing border violence, from harboring slaves, and in typical Andrew Jackson fashion, Jackson's going to kind of do whatever he thinks he should do, and he's going to take a very heavy hand, and he's going to go against orders, and he could have gotten himself in very deep legal trouble. He's going to end up going into Florida, and he's not just going to basically make small wars with the Seminoles. He's going to go and he's going to destroy every Seminole village he comes across. You see here in the map showing his Florida campaign. This map, what it shows is Andrew Jackson's actions during the War of 1812. You see the Battle of New Orleans. here. But now let's look over at these other arrows that are going into the the peninsula part of Florida. Basically, Andrew Jackson goes in and he starts destroying Seminole villages. Not only that, he's actually going to attack Spanish owned forts, again, going directly against orders. Uh, and again, if you commit insubordination, if you disobey orders when you're in the military, there's usually a pretty big penalty. So again, he is going to make war on Spanish owned forts. He is going to go take the governor of Spain and remove the governor from power. I think he arrests him. I don't think he kills him, but he at least arrests him and he removes him from power. And a lot of Americans were shocked by this because they said, oh no, we're going to start a war with Spain. Andrew Jackson was a very bold and daring person. He would like to push the envelope. And in the end, most of the people in the US government are not a big fan of what he does, and Spain's not a big fan of what he does. But at this point, Spain is kind of tired of dealing with Florida, kind of tired of owning Florida. They had taken over Florida hoping to find gold there. They hadn't found gold there. They hadn't found any fountain of youth there. So in the end, this bold move by Jackson, he kind of gets away with it. And Jackson's the type of person that can do things that are unethical or maybe even illegal and get away with it. He just has that sheer force of personality. And again, Spain at this point doesn't really want Florida anymore anyway. And so what ends up happening is that Spain agrees to sell Florida to the United States. So in 1819, as a result of Jackson's bold slash unethical slash insubordinate actions, regardless of how he did it, in the end, it's almost like the ends justify the means, and Spain agrees to sell Florida. It's sometimes called the Florida Purchase Treaty. The more technical, formal name for this will be the Adams-Onis Treaty. So now at this point, the United States owns every bit of land east of the Mississippi River that we own today, for the most part, for the sake of this class. There will be some border disputes up in Maine later on, more on that. Maybe a little bit later on, but that's not super important. Now we have Florida. All the rest of our major land acquisitions are going to be out west. So now look at the bottom left-hand side. I'm not done talking about Andrew Jackson, by the way. This will be another thing that helps him become a very strong presidential candidate in 1824. Long story short, Andrew Jackson is the kind of person that gets things done, and he's going to be very popular, especially with your more common, less wealthy Americans, especially in the southern and western part of the country. Okay, now to the section on westward expansion. So Americans are going to start moving into the Louisiana Territory, and a lot of Americans are going to move to Louisiana, which becomes a state, which makes sense because that's where New Orleans is. It borders the Mississippi River. The port city, New Orleans, is there. That makes sense. But a lot of Americans are also going to start moving into an area that becomes known as Missouri. And a lot of slave owners move into Missouri. And a lot of slave owners want to bring Missouri into the United States as a slave state. And that will later on create tension. Overall, there is this idea, or there is this tension over whether or not slavery should expand westward. And when Missouri decides it's ready to become a state and it wants to come in as a slave state, that is going to create tension with northern states that don't want to see slavery expand. If you look at this map here, all of these states up in the north, they do not have slavery. Remember, the northern states got rid of slavery. By around the time Missouri comes along and the Northwest Ordinance, those states that came out of the Northwest Territory, they did not have slavery. And so again, keep in mind that this issue of slavery in the West will cause sectionalism to return. More on that later, but whenever the sectionalism over Western slavery comes about, it will be over the admission of Missouri. And that will lead to the Missouri Compromise. More on that later. So here we are, the United States, and we're starting to expand more and more into the western part of our continent. We've taken Florida, we're starting to move westward, we're starting to move into the Louisiana Territory, and we might not stop with the Louisiana Territory. Well, it just so happens that other countries at the same time are also wanting to expand their territory in North America, and the United States saw that as a threat. Some of these European countries, or Russia, wanted to expand in North America, some of them wanted to expand into South America, and by this point, the United States sees that as a threat. We start to say to ourselves, if we let another country get a large amount of territory in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, then that could be a threat to the United States. Because if another country, say Russia, and Russia was creeping down, if you look at this globe here, Russia was kind of creeping down this area where Alaska is, towards the Oregon territory. This was seen as a threat to the United States. Other European countries were starting to try to claim areas here. And in the spirit of nationalism, in the spirit of patriotism, we are going to make a bold exclamation. And James Monroe is going to issue in 1823 what becomes later known as the Monroe Doctrine, where we basically say to the European countries or to Russia, we say, whatever land you have now, you can have, but you can have no more. And basically, what we're saying in the Monroe Doctrine is that any land that is left unclaimed belongs to the United States. So this is a very bold move that represents our confidence. It represents our nationalism during this time, and that is known as the Monroe Doctrine. Put a star next to the Monroe Doctrine, circle it, highlight it. This is one of the major things from this unit you'll need to remember long term. Basically, because we're feeling stronger, because we're feeling bold and patriotic, we basically put, if you will, like a barbed wire fence around North and South America, and we say that it is now off limits to any future expansion from European powers. So you remember in Unit 1 and in Unit 2, there was this talk about other countries. Maybe even in Unit 3, you talked about other European countries gaining more land in the Western Hemisphere. No more. At this point, we are claiming that all of this land that has not been claimed belongs to us. So this is the end of European colonization or expansion in the New World. Now, could these European countries have ganged up on us and called our bluff? Probably. We weren't really strong enough to really enforce this, but these European countries decided not to challenge the Monroe Doctrine, and they focused their expansion elsewhere, ultimately in places like Africa and in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, etc. So right now we're basically claiming North and South America, and eventually there will be this idea known as manifest destiny, where we start to associate this idea of expansion with basically this idea that God has given us a mission to expand and take this land for ourselves. So right now it's a very political, kind of patriotic related notion that this land belongs to us. Eventually we'll start to lump religious ideas and say that it is a divine or God-given right to have this land. More on that later on. On to the last theme, and the last theme will be economic nationalism. I brought up accidentally both boxes at the same time, but that's okay. So start in the left-hand box where it says economic nationalism, and then go to the right-hand box where it says a new economic plan. Both of these are associated with a man on the left, Henry Clay. So Henry Clay I introduced to you in an earlier lecture, and he will be one of the most influential politicians in American history. He will be known for his compromises that kind of stall the Civil War from happening sooner. We'll talk more about that later. Right now, let's talk about the part where he kind of acts like a new Alexander Hamilton. So remember that the economy grows during the era of good feelings. That's the first box that says economic nationalism. Follow the arrow to the right, and we'll see Henry Clay's economic plan. So just like Alexander Hamilton had his economic plan or his financial plan, so will Henry Clay. His proposal, which does not entirely become a reality, but it is his proposal, will be known as the American system. So kind of star and highlight that one. That will be the theme pretty much of the rest of this lecture. So you see here that we're about to enter another chart, and this chart is divided into three main parts. In the middle oval, I want you to put the American system. Again, in the middle oval, put the American system. And what this American system is going to do is it's going to be a plan that is a lot like Alexander Hamilton's plan, but it's also going to be focused on expanding our country from not just this part, the North and the South, but also out west. And how are you going to get people to move out west? By building roads, canals, railroads, things that can help people move out there and then trade whatever they produce out there back to the East Coast. So, more on that later on. But again, I'm going to talk about the North and the South and the West and how they react to this. But let me go ahead and start changing definitions for you a little bit. Because the West is an evolving definition, the South is kind of an evolving definition too. Whenever I say north, I mean this area here that I'm circling. Basically, Pennsylvania, New York, and the New England area. When I talk about the West, I'm talking about where the Northwest Territory was and is eventually becoming states, what I'm circling now. When I talk about the South, I mean basically everything else down here. Now, if you remember with Hamilton's plan, the North liked it and the South and the West didn't. With Henry Clay's plan, the West is actually going to like this plan a little bit more, and you're going to start seeing the western part of the country start to be more closely linked to the North and less closely linked to the South. Okay, so again, in the middle oval, put the American system. We'll start with part number one. So part number one of the plan, the American system, one more time, put the American system in the middle oval if you want full credit for notes. Part number one will be bringing back the Bank of the United States. So the Bank of the United States had actually been allowed to expire. That was one of the compromises that the Democratic Republicans made to allow for it to be created during Hamilton's time. But Henry Clay is going to come along and he's basically going to say, we need to bring back the Bank of the United States because it helps create a stable economy. So the government is going to recharter or basically create a new Bank of the United States. And again, McCulloch versus Maryland had indirectly ruled that this was constitutional. That doesn't mean the South believes it, doesn't mean the West believes it, but they will go, it will become part of the plan. So the Bank of the United States, again, will be there to manage the national economy, and this time the national economy is really starting to take off after the War of 1812. It was already growing before the War of 1812. It's going to take off even more after the war is done. So what are the reactions going to be? Pretty much the same that you saw the reactions be to the first Bank of the United States. The North likes it. Again, the northern businessmen that had lots of money could own stock in the Bank of the United States. They could make money off of it. And here's the scary thing, is that also foreign wealthy people could own stock in the Bank of the United States. That's something that makes a lot of people suspicious, including Andrew Jackson. You'll find out later on that one of the biggest enemies of Andrew Jackson is going to be the Bank of the United States. He was born in the South, grew up in the West, and he is going to distrust the Bank of the United States, especially since foreigners can own stock in it. And overall, he will believe it is unconstitutional, even though the Supreme Court basically said that it was. Eventually, whenever we get to Andrew Jackson's presidency, you'll see him make war on the Bank of the United States and basically take it out. But right now, as part of Henry Clay's plan, the Bank of the United States is reestablished. You have a second Bank of the United States. The North likes this, the South and the West does not. The next part of Henry Clay's plan, which again mirrors Alexander Hamilton's old plan, is going to be tariffs, but with a tweak. So this time you're going to have not just tariffs, but what we'll call protective tariffs. So go to the right-hand side of this chart and we'll see protective tariffs for part number two. These tariffs are going to be much higher than before, and they're not just there to raise money for the federal government and to protect American businesses from foreign competition, but they're very much more intentional in their desire to protect from foreign competition. So they'll be much higher than before. And again, with more intentionality when it comes to protecting American businesses from foreign competition. So who likes this? The northern factories. The northern factories are going to be able to grow and grow even faster with the tariffs being as high as they were. And one problem, though, with this is that they can raise their prices. Now, this is good if you're a northern factory. You can raise the price of the product that you're creating. The problem is that the products that you are creating are largely going to the western part of the country or the southern part of the country, and suddenly you're raising prices on the north or on the western part of the country and on the southern part of the country. For example, we'll talk about later on about how northern factories create cotton gins, very expensive cotton gins that the South needs to process cotton. But they can get away with these higher prices because of the protective tariffs being so high that even though the prices have gone up, they're still cheaper than the foreign cotton gins that might be created. When it comes to the West is going to be buying steel plows and mechanical reapers from northern factories. More on that later on. And the North is going to be able to charge pretty high prices for this because, again, they're so well protected by the tariffs. The other problem, again, just like before, is that whenever the United States raises tariffs on products coming in from other countries are going to raise their tariffs on stuff that the South and the West is sending overseas. Again, the South is creating cotton, the West is creating other agricultural products, more edible products, and whenever they try to sell these products to countries like Britain, they face higher tariffs. And eventually, this tariff issue is going to tick off the South so much that South Carolina is even going to consider seceding from the Union, not over slavery, but over tariffs. That'll happen in the 1820s and 30s when Andrew Jackson is president. More on that later on. So, long story short, yet again, the North likes tariffs, the South and the West doesn't. However, with these tariffs being raised, Henry Clay proposes to use this extra money to pay for something that the West is really going to like. So in the end, there's something in the West, something in it for the West. And that'll bring us down to part number 3. Part number 3 is internal improvements. Internal improvements is a fancy word for infrastructure, and infrastructure is a fancy word for basically roads, railroads, tunnels, bridges, any kind of transportation system. Okay, so internal improvements again, the tariff revenue that would be raised from the protective tariffs would be used to pay for these internal improvements, to pay for roads, to pay for bridges, to pay for canals, to pay for railroads. And there will be a lot of debate among the states, between the states and the national government, as to whether or not roads, canals, railroads, whether or not they should be built by the federal government or by state governments. Now, today, it's kind of a mixture. Today, the interstate highway system is operated by the federal government and regulated by the federal government, but at the same time, you have state highways as well. So this part of Henry Clay's plan said that the federal government should use protective tariffs to pay for this infrastructure, to pay for roads, canals, and railroads. In the end, this part gets largely rejected and the states have to pay for it themselves. More on that later on. But at this point, the plan is for the federal government to pay for these internal improvements, to pay for this infrastructure, to pay for these roads. And what this would do was it would encourage more trade in the country. For example, look at this map here. You would see more canals, more railroads. There would be, it's basically twofold. Number one is that if you build a railroad or a canal or some sort of road, people are going to move where roads are. They're going to move to where transportation systems are. If you were offered a free house, but there was no road within 10 miles of the house, you probably wouldn't take the house because you'd have no connection to the rest of society. So you have to have some sort of connection. So again, if you look at this map, wherever roads and canals and railroads are being built, that is where people are going to move. So this helps people move, especially out west. It's also going to help with trade. Once people move out to these areas, especially western New York, western Pennsylvania, and into the old Northwest territory, people will start growing crops, and then they'll start selling these crops back to the eastern cities, which are starting to grow. More on that later on. So the North likes this and the West likes this because if you look at the map, there are a whole lot more internal improvements in the North and the West under this plan. Now, in the end, it's going to end up being largely the states that pay for this, but also keep in mind that it is mostly in the North and the West, not so much in the South. So the South doesn't like this because according to Clay's plan, which again had the national government building these infrastructures, according to this national plan, the North and the West are going to get a lot more of these internal improvements. The South is not going to get nearly as much. And again, in the South especially, they felt like the states should pay for internal improvements, not the federal government. Now, keep in mind that the President of the United States during this time is James Monroe, and James Monroe, like many other of the early presidents, he was from Virginia, so James Monroe is not going to like the idea of the federal government paying for all these roads and canals and railroads. He's going to say so that the state should do that, but it was part of Henry Clay's plan, and in the end, you do see a lot of infrastructure being built. The most famous example of a state taking on the building of infrastructure, by the way, will be probably the Erie Canal here in New York, and I'll talk more about that at a later date. But overall, in theory at least, even though again internal improvements becomes a lot more debated later on, in theory at least, the American system is going to help build a national economy, trade throughout the country. It's going to depend on money coming from tariffs that hurt the South more than any other area. But in the end, it is supposed to help build a national economy, which again reflects nationalism. People are going to start buying and selling things on a national scale much more than on a local scale. So instead of just buying something in your local town that's been produced in your local town, you might be buying something that's been shipped from another part of the country, which in a sense will unify the country because the different regions of the country are going to be buying and selling stuff from each other. For example, the North is going to sell cotton gins to the South, and the South is in turn going to sell fresh cotton to the North, where it will be processed in northern factories. But again, remember that while at the time it seems like it's going to kind of knit the different regions of the country together, the South does end up having fewer internal improvements. They do end up kind of feeling left out of this internal improvements game, and it's going to be the West and the North that are going to get closer together, and the South is going to be kind of the odd man out. So again, overall, the American system does help develop a national economy that, at least for a time, will overshadow sectionalism because it does unite the regions of the country. It does not unite the regions of the country very fairly, especially because the tariffs hurt the South, especially because the South doesn't get as many internal improvements, especially because the South and the West both dislike the Bank of the United States. But that sectionalism doesn't really get riled up till later on. So right now, the nationalism and the growing of the national economy is more uniting than it is dividing. More on the development of sectionalism in later lectures.